So finance, the fifth part of the 5 parts of every business. So we've created something valuable, we have attracted the attention of a prospect and made them interested, we've convinced them to trust us enough to go through the transaction, we've actually delivered upon the promises that we've made to our customer in a way that makes them happy. Life is good, right? We created something valuable, somebody else paid us for it, mission accomplished. Finance is basically the process of watching your business system operate. And as your business system operates, money is flowing in the form of sales, and money is flowing out in the form of expenses, right? So when you're creating value, you're spending money. When you're marketing, you're spending money. When you're delivering value, you're spending money. And sales is the part where the money comes in. So instead of jumping straight into this very complicated picture of what financial analysis in business is, if you just take a step back, we're just watching the money come in, and we're watching the money go out, and we're answering 2 very important and very fundamental questions. Question number 1 is more money flowing in than is flowing out? If it's not, you have an issue to deal with, because that's not going to be sustainable for very long. The second question is it enough? So as you're operating the business, you're working a lot, you're spending a lot of time, you're giving up other things that you could be doing with your life. And the business has to return to you a certain amount of extra money that you get to keep in order for it to be worth it for you to continue doing what you're doing. So finance, broken down to the barest bones, is watching money go in and out, seeing is it enough for you to keep going.
Finance. Questions for reflection. How much money is flowing into and out of your business system? How much money do you need to bring in to keep going?
So very first definition that we're going to have in finance is a simple one: profit. Profit is what you keep after you bring in the money and you spend what you need to spend in order to deliver that successfully. So for a business to survive, it must make a profit. You can't operate at a loss forever. And a lot of people think about or use terms like profit margin. And profit margin is a very useful way to compare things versus each other. So if you have 2 items, they may have different prices, they may have different expenses, so they're hard to compare versus each other. But if you convert that profit to a percentage of the overall money that you take in, that you get to keep, that is what's called a profit margin. You can use your profit margin to compare some segments of the business versus another. So if product A gets you 75% margin and product B gets you 50% margin, product A is more profitable than product B. So it's just a very basic method of comparison. It's nothing more complicated than that. Now, profits also provide a cushion to the business to deal with unexpected events. Great example. When I was working on the Dawn dishwashing detergent brand, one of the primary raw materials that goes into the production of dish soap is actually petroleum. And while I was working on Dawn, that was the first major petroleum spike in about a decade. And so our raw material costs went up. As your costs go up, if your price stays the same, your profits go down, right? Basic addition and subtraction. And so the more profitable a product is, the more you can withstand sudden spikes in your expenses and still maintain a sufficient profit margin to keep going. If you're operating at razor-thin margins and anything changes, anything unexpected occurs, any one of those inputs that go into the business process spikes in terms of cost, you suddenly find yourself in very deep trouble very quickly. And so the higher the profit margin, the more resilient the business is in a lot of ways. You can withstand a lot more unexpected things happening because you have profits there to provide a little bit of a cushion there as well. Not to mention is, if those things don't happen, you end up keeping more of the money that you make. So the other thing to remember in terms of profit is profits are really important. You need to have them, or you're not going to be in business very long. You need to have enough of them, or some unexpected change is going to negatively impact your business. But they don't have to be the only goal that you focus on as you either start or you operate a business. So it is perfectly appropriate, depending upon the goals of the business, to make sure you have enough profit to make it worth it for you to keep going. But once you have that enough profit, you can optimize for other things. You can optimize on the impact that the business will have in the lives of the people you're serving. You can optimize in terms of your personal time and attention, so you can focus on things other than the business. Maximizing profits does not have to be the one and only irrevocable goal of the business, period. Profits are a means to the end. The end is what you choose it to be, and you can optimize the business for that as long as you have at least sufficient profits.
Derek Sivers' video about
Derek Sivers, yeah. Great example of that. At a certain point, while Derek was building CD Baby, he said, I am making more than enough money. I am here to serve all of these musicians. I care about that a lot. And we're just going to do whatever makes them happy as long as we can do that sustainably. So yeah, there are all sorts of different examples. You don't have to chase every penny on the bottom line. You really don't. You do have to make sure you're A, profitable, and B, profitable enough that you have a certain amount of resilience. That's really the goal here.
Profit margin. Questions for reflection. How profitable is your offer in both dollar and percentage terms? Is your business bringing in more than it's spending?
Now, as we're talking about profits, it helps to think about what I call value capture. And value capture is the process of retaining some percentage of the value provided in every transaction. So this is going back to the value-based selling we were talking about earlier. If you are creating value for the customer, you get paid by capturing some of that value for yourself. That's how you justify your fee or justify the cost of the transaction. Now, there's an interesting middle path here between not enough and too much. So the more value you capture in the transaction, the less attractive that transaction becomes to the person on the other end of the deal. So if you are able to design a piece of software that saves a company $10 million and you charge $9,999,999, technically it's still rational for the company to take you up on that, right? Because they're $1 ahead than they would otherwise be. But when you factor in all of the other things, the time and the attention and the effort and the maintenance and all of those things, the more value you capture from that transaction, the less attractive it is for the other party to say, okay, let's go ahead. So it's this interesting balance that in every transaction you need to capture enough value that you're bringing in enough profit to compensate you for the work you're doing. But if you try to push that threshold too high and capture too much of the value, you're detracting from the reason that people are doing business with you in the first place. So part of why my personal rule of thumb is 10 to 20% of the value of the transaction is that's enough, typically, if you're creating enough value. It's enough to compensate you fairly for what you're adding to the transaction, but it's not so much that people choose not to do business with you because it's just not worth their time. Now, there are some competing philosophies. My personal belief in this is not the only one that you will see out there in the world. One very common approach to value capture you could call maximization. And this is the type of value capture philosophy that's typically taught in places like business school. And value capture maximization looks like this. You have a duty to the owners and the shareholders of your company to make as much money as you possibly can, period. If there is a situation in which you can make a decision and make more money, it is your responsibility to do that, because that's what you were hired to do. Sounds good. Sounds like a path of bringing in more money by encouraging your employees to look for ways to maximize the amount of profit. But the risk in that is if you push the value capture too high, you start undermining the reason that people are doing business with you in the first place. So in the short term, it tends to be effective at driving up short-term profits. In the long term, it tends to erode the base of the business and why people choose to do business with you. The opposite end of the scale is value capture minimization. And minimization is the idea that the organization should capture as little value as possible as long as it remains sufficient. And Derek Sivers and CD Babies are a really great example of that. The purpose of the business was to be financially sufficient and help as many people as possible. And if they could help more people by keeping their prices the same or as low as humanly possible, then great, that was a good thing. The more musicians CD Baby was helping, the better, as long as the company could maintain sufficiency. And so that is not a path to maximizing your short-term profits, but it may be a path to maximizing your long-term profitability and potential, because you're providing so much value to so many people that it's going to be very difficult for someone to compete with you.
Costco is another great.
Costco is a great example. How is Costco a great example?
They set a threshold for their margins for each individual product.
Yes.
And they say this is the maximum amount of
15%. 15%. And Sam's Club is the same way. And the reason they do that is businesses like Sam's Club and Costco don't make most of their money on selling the individual units. They make most of their profits off of selling the membership to Sam's Club or Costco, because that's basically pure money for them. So part of their value proposition is you are going to get the absolute best deal if you buy this thing at Sam's Club or Costco. And because you can be sure that you're going to get the best deal, you should pay $30 or $40 a year just to have access to the club. So on a per unit profit margin basis, Sam's Club and Costco have decided to make the minimum they need to sustain their operations in the area. The profits come from something else, which is access to the store in the first place. So the moral of the story here is, if you look at maximization and minimization as the two ends of a spectrum or a continuum, most businesses will fall somewhere in the middle, and usually closer to one side than the other. It's important to realize that not every business has to operate under the same philosophy, and that as the business owner or the entrepreneur, you get to choose which strategy you operate on. And both can work as long as you're very conscious about what strategy you're using and you work to overcome the limitations of that strategy when it comes to both short-term profit and long-term profit.
Value capture. Questions for reflection. How much value are you currently capturing from each transaction? Are you trying to capture too little or too much?
Now, sufficiency is the point that we were talking about, the point at which your business is bringing in enough profit in order to make it worth it for you to keep going for the foreseeable future. So the maximization, as we talked about, the maximization of profits is not everything. It's more important what you choose to do with those profits. And the other end of that spectrum is you can't create value if you can't pay the bills. If your business is not financially sufficient, the business is effectively on life support. It's only a matter of time before it will cease to exist. And so sufficiency is that point where you're making enough profit to make it worth it for you to keep going. And that's the magic point where you get to choose when it comes to things like value capture, and it comes to things like, if you have an hour, do you spend it working on the business, or do you spend it with your family, or doing some hobby that you enjoy? Before you reach the point of sufficiency, those types of decisions become very hard to make because you're not making enough money to keep going. Once you're making enough money to keep going, it's far easier to take a step back and say, okay, I'm sufficient now. What is the best use of my time? Do I want to keep growing my business? Do I want to do something else? Now, a very useful way to think about this is what I call target monthly revenue, which I abbreviate TMR. So most businesses, this is kind of easier to visualize on a small business level, but it works the same even in larger companies. Think of you are starting a business in your basement. You have to pay the rent. You have to pay your utilities. You have to have enough money for food and water and maybe some insurance, right? There's a minimum amount of money you need every month to keep doing those things. Once you get above that point, you can keep going for another month. That threshold is your target monthly revenue, the amount of money that you have to pay all of your bills and make it worth it for you to keep going. And thinking about target monthly revenue is helpful when you're starting a business. So what does this thing need to be in order for me to sustain myself here? It also is really helpful when you're running a larger company and you're able to see how many customers do I have, how much money is coming in, do I need to bring in more customers? Do I need to bring in more customers that are paying me more? You can start to make some very high-level strategic decisions by knowing how much money your business is going through on a monthly basis. Now, it's important to understand that sufficiency is completely subjective. Different people are going to have different thresholds of what constitutes worth it or enough. And so, depending on the type of operation that you have, your expenses may be really low, and so your sufficiency point is low. Or you have lots of expenses on a monthly basis, and you have to bring in enough profit on a monthly basis to make that sustainable. Completely subjective, completely dependent upon the operation. But the principle of getting to sufficiency before you get to make those other decisions is always in effect. And the way that I define a successful business, which is another very subjective term, the way I personally define what makes a business successful is, are they consistently at or above the point of sufficiency or not? If they are, that's a successful business. Doesn't matter if they're bringing in $1,000 a month or if they're bringing in $1 billion a month. As long as they're above where they need to be and they're happy with that and it makes it worth it for them to keep doing what they're doing, successful business. Simple as that. So sufficiency is, it's enough money is coming in for all of my goals. So you can include things like if you want to save for retirement and you're not willing to not save for retirement, then yes, that would be part of your sufficiency goal. Very, very simple definition. If you are at or above sufficiency, you're a successful business owner. If not, you have some work to do. I mean, if the end goal is you want to spend all day with your family and fishing and, playing guitar with your amigos in the evening, if that's the end goal, whatever allows you to get there is success, right? And you don't have to put yourself through absolute hell building a huge business if the end goal is not the satisfaction of having a huge business. And this is one of those things that culturally, from an academic standpoint, the successful businesses are the businesses that earn billions of dollars, right? You're not a successful business until you're a big one. That's completely false. And the wonderful part of being a business owner is you get to choose how you go about going through the business process and what is the best end result for you. And whatever helps you get there is the best way to operate that business for you at that time.
Sufficiency. Questions for reflection. What is your current point of financial sufficiency? Have you reached it yet? How could you reduce the time it'd take to become financially sufficient?
Now, speaking of making money, there are really only 4 ways to make money. And this is one of those things that, as I was learning, it kind of blew my mind. Because you think about as varied a topic as business is, it's like there are thousands, there are millions of ways of making money. But when you dig down into it, there's really only 4. And regardless of who you are or what you do, it's going to fall into one of these 4 categories. So there are only 4 ways to increase your business's revenue. You can, number 1, increase the number of customers you serve. Number 2, you could increase the average transaction size. So you try to encourage each customer to purchase more from you. Number 3 is you can increase the frequency of transactions per customer. So that's trying to get your customers to purchase from you more often. And number 4, you can raise your prices. That's it. Very simple checklist. All of the different ways that you can make money are going to fall into fundamentally one of those 4 camps. So a good way to visualize this is think of a restaurant. If you want to increase the restaurant's revenue, you have 4 options. You can market the business and try to get more new people in the door. It's number 1, bringing in new customers. You can encourage each customer to purchase more, which the famous McDonald's "would you like fries with that" is a great example, right? You get people who would typically only buy a burger to buy fries and a soft drink in addition, and all of a sudden you're making more money. Hence the value meal, right? You can increase the frequency of transactions per customer by giving customers a reason to come to your restaurant twice a week or 3 times a week instead of once a week. So places like coffee shops, loyalty programs of trying to get people to come in every single morning to buy their coffee That's a frequency strategy, getting people to buy from you more often.
We had a Starbucks recently that you would buy something in the morning, and if you brought your receipt in after
Exactly.
2 p.m., then you could have another beverage for free, and their hopes were you brought somebody with you or you upgraded whatever they
Yeah.
were offering.
Yes. So, and the fourth strategy is just raising your prices, right? So if an average entree in a restaurant costs $10 and you double that to $20, as long as people buy the same number of entrees, you make more money. That's it. So it doesn't matter what business you're running. If you want to make more money, use that checklist, come up with a couple ideas how you could do each one, and start systematically test them. And you will find a couple of them that will indeed net you more money. Now, it's important to remind ourselves here that remember the lesson of qualification too. Not every customer that you can attract via these strategies is a good customer. So a great way when you're thinking about increasing your revenue is have a picture in your mind of who your ideal customer looks like. And try to find strategies in each of these 4 areas that would increase the probability that your ideal customer purchases from you, purchases more from you, or purchases more often at a higher price.
4 methods to increase revenue. Questions for reflection. How can you use the 4 methods to increase your business's revenue? How can you encourage your customers to become more like your ideal customer?
Now, raising prices is an interesting topic in and of itself. So a quick definition here is pricing power. And pricing power is your ability to raise your prices over time. So there are some businesses where when you raise your prices, your demand stays pretty much the same. I think the classic example of this is See's Candies in California, which Warren Buffett acquired a number of years ago. And See's Candies raises their prices on a regular basis anywhere between 8 and 10%. And the same number of people buy. And they do it over time, so it doesn't feel like a big shock. But there's a remarkable amount of plasticity in terms of how much people will pay for this product over time. And they just increase and increase and increase and increase. And being able to increase your prices and having some room to increase your prices is a very beneficial thing, because if your raw materials go up, if your transportation costs go up, if your insurance costs go up, any of the variables that go into the creating of something, those costs, if they go up, if you have pricing power, can potentially be passed through to the end purchaser. So the more pricing power you have, the more secure that part of the business is for you.
It's another great example also of that, a premium brand where you feel like you're buying something excellent because it's more expensive.
Yes.
They do not compete on price whatsoever. And they have incredible repurchase tendency.
Yep.
So people who buy See's Candies as gifts for someone will often buy them every year.
So pricing power is really great because even in terms of standard things like inflation, which makes the cost of everything go up over time, you need to have a certain amount of pricing power to be able to maintain your sufficiency as your prices are going up. So if you have the ability to increase your prices as well, that'll help you maintain sufficiency over time. Most of the time, you can test raising your prices relatively quickly without a backlash, as long as people aren't following the history of the price. And that's the trick on pricing. A lot of times, there's probably going to be some subsegment of people who aren't going to like it. And in the end, that may still be okay. And you don't know until you test.
Pricing power. Questions for reflection. How sensitive are your customers to price increases? Would raising your prices make it easier for your business to remain sufficient? How much room do you have to raise prices without losing too many customers?
Two related concepts now in terms of thinking about your customers and how much they are worth to the continued operation of your business. The first concept is lifetime value. And lifetime value is the total value of a customer's business over the lifetime of their relationship with your company. So the interesting thing about lifetime value is if your business is establishing some sort of relationship with a customer, The value of what they're going to spend with you over the lifetime of their relationship with you multiplies however much they tend to spend times however long they tend to do business with you. And that number, depending on the business, can be pretty high.
Lifetime value. Questions for reflection. What is the average lifetime value of a new customer for your business? Is it high or low? What could you do to increase the lifetime value of each customer?
By understanding how much the customer purchases from you and how long they stay with you, you can place a tangible dollar value on every new customer that enters your business. And what that allows you to do is use a concept called allowable acquisition cost, abbreviated AAC. So allowable acquisition cost is the lifetime value of a customer as applied to marketing. So if you know that every new customer on average that does business with you spends over the lifetime of that relationship $10,000, and you have a marketing strategy that can bring new customers into your business for $500, it seems expensive in the absolute, right? You're spending $500 to bring a person in the door, and they may only be spending 20 bucks up front. But if you know that over the lifetime of that relationship you're going to net $10,000, it becomes a very different calculation. That's how a lot of businesses, particularly subscription businesses, can have such high upfront costs in acquiring a new customer because they know over a period of time that customer is going to be well worth the initial investment. You may lose money on the upfront sale, and that's okay because you're establishing a relationship that's going to pay off on the long term. So a lot of times you may not have that much money to acquire new customers. Typically, with new businesses, there's typically a segment of customers that you could call the low-hanging fruit. They're not hard to reach. They're excited about what you do. They come into the business relatively easily. And so the first step of a business is really focusing on who those people are and starting to market to them. Once you have a certain amount of resources and a certain amount of data about how much people tend to spend over time, you can start to do more expensive things to reach people you may not be able to reach in other ways. So advertising, trade show promotion, direct mail, all of these things cost money to do, and you need to make sure that before you do them and spend a lot of money doing them, you know how much every customer is worth to your business. And there's a virtuous cycle that happens because the more profitable your offer is, typically the higher the lifetime value of each additional new customer, the higher the lifetime value of the customer, the higher your allowable acquisition costs and the more things that you can do to get new customers into the business. Yes. So this is one of those things that particularly when you're starting a business, you're not going to know the lifetime value. You're not going to know the allowable acquisition cost up front. So as you're starting a business particularly, you need to be collecting information about these things. How much do people tend to spend? How long do they stick around? And based on your finances, how much can you afford to spend at this moment in time to bring a new customer into the business? And that the more you can spend, the more options are at your disposal in terms of tactics and techniques in order to do that.
Allowable acquisition cost. Questions for reflection. How much can you reasonably spend to attract a new customer? Could you use a loss leader to establish a new relationship with a high lifetime value customer?
Now, another major idea in finance, and something you may have heard, is this idea of overhead. And overhead is the minimum ongoing resources required for your business to continue operations. So if you have an office, you probably pay a rent or lease on the office, you have to pay the water, you have to pay the electricity. If you have employees that are on a salary, you have to pay their salary, you have to pay your insurance. There's a bunch of things you have to pay month in, month out in order for the business to continue operations. And those things, added all together, constitutes your overhead, the minimum amount of money you're going to spend just keeping the lights on for another month. Now, the lower your overhead logically follows, the less revenue you need on a monthly basis to keep going. So if you're a startup, Doing things to minimize your overhead is a really good thing, right? So instead of buying a desk, you may get a couple milk crates and an old door from Home Depot because it costs you $10 instead of a couple $100. And that's a good thing because you're spending less money in the startup of your business. Managing your overhead is very critically important if you're building your company on a fixed amount of capital, whether you're financing it yourself or whether you have investors that are helping you finance it. If you only have a certain pool of money, you only have a certain amount of time before that money is going to run out, right? Sometimes they call the rate at which you're spending money your burn rate. So how fast are you burning through the money you have at your disposal? The lower your overhead, the lower your burn rate. The lower your burn rate, the more time you have until you must reach sufficiency or you go out of business. And the lower your overhead, typically the higher your profitability and the greater your flexibility in terms of what you choose to do in your business and what you choose not to.
Overhead. Questions for reflection. How much are you spending each month, even if you don't sell anything? How can you minimize your business's expenses without affecting critical capabilities?
Now, overhead is one type of cost, and that cost tends to be called a fixed cost. It's a cost you're going to incur regardless of whether you sell anything that month. But that's not the only type of cost. Variable costs are directly related to how much you create. So let's say you're running a custom t-shirt company and you make your own t-shirts. If you don't sell any t-shirts, you probably don't need to buy any cotton that month. But if you sell a ton of t-shirts, you need to buy more cotton and more raw materials to actually make the t-shirts. So for every t-shirt you make, there's a certain amount of material you have to buy. And that cost is variable depending on your volume. So it's important to separate the costs that you're going to incur regardless, which constitute your overhead, and the costs that are going to go up as your volume increases. Now, going back to some of the things we talked about in terms of accumulation and amplification, if you can reduce a fixed cost, so let's say renegotiate the lease on your space, if you save $100 a month, that savings is going to accumulate. It's an additive effect. And by the end of the year, you're going to save $1,200, right? A reduction in your variable cost is amplified by your total volume. So if every t-shirt that you make costs $1 less, you're going to save $1 multiplied by the entire volume of t-shirts that you sell, period. So reductions in fixed costs accumulate, reductions in variable costs multiply over time. And it's important to understand that all we're doing right now from a mathematical standpoint is addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. That's it. And financial analysis is using addition, subtraction, multiplication, division to look at the numbers of an operating business and make decisions about what to do next. That's it. That's the core. It's not complicated. I gave out a supplementary thing that says business financial report for a year. A lot of people ask, well, how do I track my finances? This is the most basic template you could use. So every row in the top part, income, list all your sources of income, put in how much you are making from every source for every month, and at the end of that row, add them all up. That was your total income for a year from a single source. When you've done that for all of your sources of income, in the total income line, add up all of those costs for a month, which will give you the total income that you have had over the course of a year. Then, we're just doing basic division here. You can turn that into a percentage, right? So how much of my income is coming from source A versus source B versus source C versus source C? That's it. Expenses work the same way. So all your expenses on a monthly basis, at the end of the year, add them up. When you've added all of them up, get a total and turn them into a percentage. So you can see what percent of your expenses are coming from sources A, B, C, D, E. And then you can calculate, just subtract, how much have I made minus how much have I spent. That's the total amount of profit that I have made, and convert that to a percentage to calculate your margin. That's it. And you add a couple other notes, like how much cash do I have on hand and what's the value of the assets that I own, and how much do I owe right now, and how much income tax do I have to pay, and all that stuff. And you can get a good working understanding of your financial picture right now. basic cash flow statement and a basic balance sheet. Basic financial analysis, this is basically what they teach you in Managerial Accounting 101. They just use bigger words. And there's an idea called financial controls, which sounds big and complicated. Basically, it's just a matter of looking at your percentages on a monthly basis, see what income and what expenses are going up versus going down, and asking yourself a very basic question: why is it going up or why is it going down? And when you track that on a monthly basis, you can start to see the changes in your numbers. There are some months where I look at my spreadsheet and I say, in this month, I had a spike in my operating expenses. What happened? Well, I hosted a masterclass, and I had to pay things like the rent on the room and the materials and all of these things that I don't normally have to pay. So I see the bump and I'm able to say, okay, why did that happen? Was that a good thing? Is there something that I need to change there? And in the case of hosting a masterclass, no, there's nothing I need to change there, so I don't need to worry about it.
I get weekly a dashboard because mine can change drastically weekly.
Yeah.
And I need to know, so I have my 30-day out, or anything past 30 days in receivables shows that. And it's in an Excel spreadsheet, and it's my cash, my receivables, my inventory, my payables, and that's it. And my 30 days, anything over 30 days in receivables. And then it's graphed for me. So like when I'm out of town or something, I don't have to actually look at the numbers. I can look at the graph and see, is there any kind of a drastic change? Did anything spike or drop?
Yeah.
And then I know, okay, go look at the spreadsheet and see exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And Excel does that for you. You just tell
Yes.
the graphic.
And part of the reason the spreadsheet is structured the way it is depending on how comfortable you are with Excel or numbers or whatever spreadsheet program you use, if you want to create a graph, you just create it from these numbers and it will tell you the exact same thing. And actually, for my business, I maintain this by myself because I want to see the numbers. At the end of the year, I send this document to my accountant and my taxes are prepared immediately. Because I already have the numbers, he's able to enter what he needs to into his software and ask me the questions he needs to ask me, and then we're done because the information is already compiled. I put all of the revenue that comes from coaching and consulting as one source of revenue because it all comes from the same channel. I get a statement every month. The numbers on that statement go into this column and I can track back to the original source. Same thing of I pay for some software like Basecamp and my hosting fees and all of that. I have a single line on this called operating expenses. So all the subscription things, my utilities go onto there, all of those things go into a single number and that doesn't change very much. But if there's something that I need to write a check for, so for example, I have a line on expenses for professional services tax, which is the check that I cut my accountant every year for preparing my tax statements. That goes on a separate line. It's mostly a judgment call. You should talk to an accountant because there are some things like travel and lodging and meals and expenses and things that have special tax rules. So it's helpful to track those on a separate line if it's easy for you to do so. Makes your accountant's life a little bit easier. There are some things that, so all of my operating expenses go on a single business credit card. I get the statement every month. That happens. However, if I do something like buy a computer or I buy a video camera, something that's abnormal and very expensive, I'll track that separately and I'll subtract that from my operating expenses line to kind of break it out because the tax rules for that are different. That requires a little bit more work, but it allows you to get a little bit more granular in terms of what your abnormal expenses are, and it also makes it easier from a tax standpoint to make sure it's coded properly. For a lot of these particular issues, the standard operating procedure is always talk to your accountant or talk to your tax preparer to see what the rules are, because the rules are ever changing and always will be. It's important that unless your business is accounting and tax preparation, you should not be doing this yourself. You should be working with someone. This is the perfect time to use a buffer in the form of an agent or a tax attorney. What you do need to know is for all of the operations of your business, your major income sources and your major expenses, you do need to know these numbers on at least a monthly basis. And tracking it in this format, it can be very, very simple, very, very straightforward. Doing it will help you run the business better. It will also make it much easier to make sure that on the tax side or on the legal side, you have all your ducks in a row the way they need to be.
Costs. Fixed and variable. Questions for reflection. Which costs of operating your business are fixed? Which costs fluctuate with changes in volume? Is there any way you can reduce your costs without reducing the amount of value you provide?
Now, next idea is an idea called incremental degradation. And incremental degradation is a fancier way of saying things getting worse over time. And unfortunately, for people in the accounting and the finance profession, there's a reputation that has developed over time of being bean counters, right? People who are really looking at how much you're spending in certain areas and coming down hard on, do you really need to be spending this? And to a certain extent, that role is valuable, right? If you're spending too much in an area and that's not necessary, if you stop spending there, you're going to make more money in terms of profit. Your profits will go up, your margins will go up. But saving money doesn't help you if it ultimately lowers the quality of your offer in order to do it. And you see this in particularly large companies over and over and over again. Companies that are typically public and have very strict profit margin requirements. So the first version of a product will come out and it'll do really, really well. But the accounting and finance department says we really need to cost save our way 20% in the next fiscal year in order to hit our profit target. So we need to make some changes to this offer to make sure we're hitting that target. So what can we do? And it may be using cheaper raw materials, could be using cheaper labor, could be sourcing it from one location versus another, could be leaving something out of the product or the offer that was in it to begin with. There's all sorts of ways to cost save, and by saving costs, increasing your profit and increasing your margins. And here's the watch out. Doing it once, yes, gets you more money, but also very subtly degrades the value of your offer to begin with. And just like the iteration cycle, if you think of this as a process that happens over and over and over and over again, what happens every time you cost save your way into profit is the value of that offer diminishes and diminishes and diminishes. And so in the end, by trying to make the offer more profitable, you destroy the value that was in the offer in the first place. I remember distinctly one of the conversations I had and large debates we had when I was working on the Swiffer brand is a similar thing. Like, we had to decrease our costs in order to hit our margin target. And for a particular product, the Swiffer WetJet, it was a battery-operated device. And in order to save money, batteries were left out of the device, which I fought tooth and nail. Because there's nothing worse for a consumer to buy a $25 cleaning implement, open it up all excited, wanting to use it, and realizing they don't have batteries. That's the worst thing that could happen. But the decision was made because it saved costs. Okay? So you have to be very, very careful when it comes to things like cutting costs to increase your profit margins, because you don't want to destroy the reason people do business with you in the first place. An example that comes to mind is a strategy that Amazon adopted recently. Amazon certified hassle-free packaging. So it is both a way of decreasing your costs while giving your customers a better experience. So Amazon basically said to a lot of its suppliers of popular products, leave off the annoying blister pack that nobody could ever open. It's expensive, it's huge, it makes the item harder to ship, it's not needed for the model. So here's what you should do. You should just put the item in a very simple cardboard box that is sealed with a sticker. It's just as secure, it's cheaper, it's lighter, it's smaller. Customers like it more, and oh, by the way, you should pass those cost savings on to us so we can offer the product at a lower price. That's a cost savings.
More environmentally friendly.
Exactly. So that's the type of cost saving thing that actually adds value to your offer instead of subtracts from it. And the wonderful thing about adding value to your offer is there's really no limit on how high you can go there. So if you're going to cut costs, doing it in a way that actually adds value instead of subtracts from it is the way you get around the incremental degradation cycle. And when you're dealing with all of these things, we are dealing with trade-offs, right? You can do more or less of something to do more or less of something else. And so it's just important to, when you're dealing with something specifically like saving costs, be very, very careful about what that's doing to the value of your offer.
Incremental degradation. Questions for reflection. Are you trying to cost save your way to profitability? Are the small changes you're making to save money degrading the value of your offer? If you have to reduce costs, can you do so in a way that minimizes the impact to your offer's quality?